Today I will be responding to a video from Xidnaf, a YouTuber who often makes videos on linguistics. It's titled, How the Nazis Stole the Word Aryan. Now this video was made in 2017, and the creator hasn't uploaded on their main channel in 2 years, so I'm sure some of you might be asking yourselves why I'm even choosing to react to this. Well, for one, hundreds of thousands of people have seen it, and I kept getting it recommended to me, so perhaps it's at least somewhat relevant today. But the real reason why I want to respond to this video is because I feel that it's a perfect example of a group of claims that I see get thrown around by people. All of these claims revolve around trying to distance Europeans from the historical Aryans, distance the spread of the Indo-European language family from any one group of ancient people that could have spread it, especially ancient Europeans, or even denying that the Sanskrit word Arya has anything to do with race at all. Usually, no evidence is really given to the contrary. They just sort of associate notions of an Aryan or Indo-European race with 19th and 20th century pseudoscience, racism, and eugenics. However, the truth is that 20th and 21st century archaeology and genetics has strengthened the idea that there was a genetically and culturally homogeneous prehistoric people from Europe and who are more genetically and phenotypically similar to modern Europeans than anybody else that spread the Indo-European languages. One final thing that I want to make clear before we jump into this, I actually like a lot of the videos that Xidnaf has made, so this is not a personal attack, but rather an attack on the ideas presented in this one specific video. With all that being said, let's begin.
In 1786, a guy named William Jones gave a speech that essentially founded the modern field of linguistics. Unfortunately, that same speech was instrumental in creating the idea of an Aryan race. Jones's speech is known today for proposing the existence of the Indo-European language family, the idea that most of the languages of Europe, Iran, and the Indian subcontinent are all variations of what used to be one single language.
So all of these things are true. Sir William Jones, while not the first person to recognize similarities between European, Iranian, and Indian languages, was basically the father of the Indo-European language family. And I think it could also be said that this would go on to create notions of an Aryan race. But considering that the hypothesized speakers of Proto-Indo-European, people associated with the Neolithic and early Bronze Age archaeological cultures in the Pontic-Caspian steppe, were genetically homogeneous, it's not really that far-fetched to say that there was some kind of Indo-European or Aryan race, albeit not exactly in the same way that Hitler would have thought of it. But more on this later.
At the time, it wasn't clear what to call this language family. Indo-European eventually became the standard, for obvious reasons, but some people wanted to call them the Japhetic languages, after a character from the Bible, and some people in Germany wanted to call them the Indo-Germanic languages, because of course they did. But some people noticed that at least some of the authors of ancient Sanskrit texts called themselves Aryans, and from there inferred that the original Proto-Indo-Europeans also called themselves Aryans, and thus they preferred to call it the Aryan language family.
Honestly, I think all of these different names for the Indo-European language family are pretty acceptable except for Japhetic, because it's just based off of the fanciful idea that these languages were spread through the descendants of the biblical patriarch of Japheth. Indo-European is pretty intuitive. It covers the geographic extremities in which the Indo-European languages were originally spoken in pre-Columbian times. I think Indo-Germanic or Indo-Germanisch accomplish basically the same thing, except even more specifically. In fact, it's literally used in Germany to this very day. It's not some archaic thing that faded out. To quote Historical Linguistics, an introduction by Winfred Lehmann, since the Germanic family is located farthest to the north and west, many scholars, especially in Germany, label the family Indo-Germanic by the designation proposed in 1810 by Konrad Malte Brun. Now, Konrad Malte Brun, by the way, is French and Danish, not German. Now, it is also true that a minority of scholars in the 19th and 20th century did use the term Aryan to describe the Indo-European languages broadly. But at least, it's an Indo-European word. It's not based off of any religious bias like Japhetic or something. I think there could be a lot worse terms to use for it.
Now, what I'm about to describe will make a lot more sense if you think about the intellectual climate of the 1800s. It hadn't been that long ago since the Enlightenment had called into question the literal accuracy of a lot of biblical narratives, and science was in the process of suggesting a lot of new ideas about the history of the world and the origin of humanity. But at the same time, the out-of-Africa theory for the origin of humans and our modern understanding of our evolution from chimpanzee-like ancestors was still a long way off. Mix all that uncertainty together with the idea of an Aryan language family, as well as a big old heaping of racism, anti-Semitism, and nationalism, colloquialism, and you get some weird ideas. Ideas like, maybe the original speakers of Proto-Aryan were white people, and all white people are descended from those original Aryan people, and that's where white people come from.
So not only is this claim not weird, but it's basically an accepted fact at this point. Let's dissect each claim here. Number one, Proto-Aryans were white people. I assume in this context they mean Proto-Indo-Europeans and not necessarily the speakers of the Proto-Indo-Aryan language. The most popular theory for the origin of Proto-Indo-European is that it was spoken in the Pontic-Caspian steppe, as well as the Balkans and Eastern and Central Europe, from about 4500 BC to 2500 BC. Then new languages diversified over time and spread throughout Eurasia during the Bronze Age, with invasions associated with various archaeological cultures that trace their origins back to Europe. This is what's known as the Kurgan hypothesis. This theory was systematized in the 1950s by Lithuanian archaeologist and feminist Maria Gimbutas, and has been modified and adjusted to new archaeological and genetic findings in more recent years. The earliest speakers of this language could have been associated with the Sredny Stog archaeological culture, as well as the closely related offshoot of the Novodanilovka-Suvarovo group. It's generally accepted by archaeologists that the Sredny Stog culture was the precursor to the Yamnaya and Corded Ware archaeological cultures, which are associated with the spread of Proto-Indo-European into Europe further. Now, there's also another theory that was popular in the USSR that is now being revived by geneticists at Harvard, known as the Armenian origin hypothesis. In the 2022 paper, The Genetic History of the Southern Arc, they proposed that Proto-Indo-European and Proto-Anatolian are actually sister languages of the broader Indo-Anatolian language group, and that it was spread to Anatolia and the Pontic-Caspian steppe by Caucasus hunter-gatherers. Now, even if this hypothesis is true, which I personally don't think it is, they still agree that the speakers of core Proto-Indo-European were associated with Neolithic and early Bronze Age steppe cultures, and that it was the main vector of dispersal of the Indo-European languages into Europe, Iran, India, and even Armenia. So whether or not you agree with the Pontic-Caspian steppe origin or the Southern Caucasus origin, we can both agree that the prehistoric people associated with the Sredny Stog, Yamnaya, and Corded Ware archaeological cultures were Proto-Indo-European speakers that serve as a vector for the spread of the Indo-European languages. So now that that is established, what were these steppe people like genetically? Well, a key feature of the steppe people is what's known as the Western steppe herder component, defined by a mixture of Caucasus hunter-gatherer and Eastern hunter-gatherer ancestry, which I would say is typified by a 4300 BC sample from the site of Vaniuchka. There's also two similar samples from Progress, the site of Progress in the northern Caucasus, sort of like southern Russia region, but they seem to have more Neolithic farmer and West Siberian hunter-gatherer admixture on average, as demonstrated by these QP-ADM models I've made using their actual genetic data. So according to a 2022 preprint where a Sredny Stog woman was analyzed with QP-ADM, she had 33.2% Ukraine Neolithic hunter-gatherer admixture, and the remaining 66.8% was Yamnaya-like. And in a recent presentation given by Professor Alexei Nikitin, he claims that the Sredny Stog culture also mixed with the neighboring early European farmers of the Kukuteni-Trypillian culture, and this would be a defining feature of the succeeding Yamnaya culture. Now, given all this information, I've inferred using QP-ADM myself that the earliest Yamnaya individuals were around 81.7% Progress and Vaniuchka related, so that's mainly steppe herder and West Siberian hunter-gatherer, 12% Ukraine Neolithic hunter-gatherer, which is a mix of Western hunter-gatherer and Eastern hunter-gatherer, and then 6.29% Trypillian farmer, which is Anatolian Neolithic farmer with some Western hunter-gatherer related admixture. All of these basic ancestral components that I just laid out are overwhelmingly West Eurasian and relevant to the formation of modern-day white Europeans. Now, if we also just take a quick look at Corded Ware individuals from Czechia, we also see that they are 73.5% similar to the Yamnaya, but the rest is Western hunter-gatherer and Anatolian Neolithic farmer related. But what about total genetic difference to modern populations? Which modern populations would be the least different from the Proto-Indo-Europeans? Well, using the FST or fixation index feature on Admix Tools 2, I was able to determine that Eastern Slavs and Northern Europeans are the least different people to the Yamnaya culture genetically, with Belarusians having an FST value of 1.89%. Now, just to put it into perspective, the difference between a Greek guy and a Norwegian guy is like 0.7%, so the Yamnaya really aren't all that close to any modern population, but that's, sort of to be expected from an early Bronze Age group. So to put it simply, if we were to place the Yamnaya or Proto-Indo-Europeans in a modern racial category, I think white or European would be the best one. Now, regarding the second claim that Europeans come from the so-called Proto-Aryans or Proto-Indo-Europeans, this is obviously true. Even before ancient DNA samples were really a thing, archaeologists and linguists who subscribed to the Kurgan hypothesis had a pretty good idea of how the steppe people spread Indo-European languages further into the then farmer-dominated Europe. I mean, there's no way to put it lightly, it involved a lot of rape and murder. And this was confirmed later because we know for a fact that early European farmer males had Y haplogroups like I2 and G, while Yamnaya and Cordoduer individuals usually had distinct subclades of R1b and R1a. Most European males today have the Cordoduer-related versions of R1b and R1a, and not the early European farmer paternal lineages. I think it's pretty obvious how that happened. And if you need autosomal DNA evidence to prove that steppe herders breeding with early European farmers had something to do with the creation of modern-day white people, then here you go. Articles have been coming out regarding it since at least 2015. But according to Xidnaf, the idea that Proto-Indo-Europeans were white and that modern Europeans in part descend from Proto-Indo-Europeans is just some weird idea that came out of the cocaine-addled minds of racist 19th century pseudoscientists.
Maybe those Aryans conquered India, but then interbred with the native black population, and that's why modern Indians have brown skin.
Already at this point, Xidnaf is basically denying the Aryan invasion, which all modern academics agree upon. The archaeological culture associated with the Indo-Iranian speakers who brought the Indo-Aryan and Iranian subgroups into India and Iran respectively is the Andronovo culture of the Middle-Late Bronze Age. This culture ultimately traces its origins back to the Cordoduer culture, and DNA samples from individuals associated with this culture often have the Cordoduer-related R1a Y haplogroup. Now, according to this QPADM model I ran, these Andronovo samples from Russia are around 75% Yamnaya-like, the rest being ANF and WHG derived, so they'd actually be more like Northern Europeans and Slavs than even the Yamnaya were because of the excess ANF admixture and Western hunter-gatherer admixture that they have. So when these fair-skinned Andronovo people came into contact with the dark-skinned Indus Valley Civilization people and did what Indo-European steppe people do, the result was an Indo-Iranian speaking group of brown people. In fact, I'd go as far to say that Southern Indians are darker skinned than Northern Indians because of the fact that they have less ancestry from these Andronovo people. Don't believe me? Here's a figure from a 2018 study by Domgaard et al. That proves that Southern Indians have little to no Middle-Late Bronze Age steppe admixture, while Indo-Iranian speakers in Pakistan, India, and Central Asia have significant amounts of it. Now, there was another 2018 study by Narasimhan et al. That goes as far as to say that there are two basic ancestral components that modern Indians come from that were formed in the 2nd millennium BC. They call these the ancestral North Indians and the ancestral South Indians. Now, the ancestral North Indians were basically the result of the Andronovo culture-related people moving into the Indus Valley Civilization people and mixing with them, and the ancestral South Indians were the result of many of the Indus Valley Civilization people being pushed further south and breeding with the more native South Asian hunter-gatherers. So the end result of this is that there's this sort of cline or continuum of South Asians, with South Indians on one extreme with little steppe and Iran Neolithic farmer ancestry and a lot of native South Asian hunter-gatherer ancestry, and Pakistanis and North Indians on the other side of the spectrum with a lot of West Eurasian admixture from the steppe and Iran Neolithic farmers and less East Eurasian admixture from South Asian hunter-gatherers. And look, I understand that these studies were published like a year after the video came out, but the thing is that it really doesn't take a genius to, infer that this happened. If you compare Tamils and Kashmiris, the difference is night and day, not only in their appearance, but in their languages too. Northern India is associated with the Indo-Aryan subgroup of the Indo-European language family, and Southern India is associated with the unrelated Dravidian language family. To me, it seems pretty obvious, even without DNA evidence, how that ended up happening.
Maybe this sacred Indian religious symbol was actually a symbol of those ancient Aryans who invaded India.
Now, the claim that this is just an ancient Indian religious symbol seems innocuous at first, but let's take a look at the description of this video. It reads, just like the swastika, it comes from India. Xidnaf is referring to the word Aryan here. Now the word swastika is actually a Sanskrit word that was borrowed into English, but to say that the symbol itself originated in India is just false. As far as we can tell, the swastika doesn't really come from anywhere. It's a fairly universal geometric shape that plenty of people have used, including and perhaps especially ancient Europeans. Xidnaf's claim about the swastika seems to be symptomatic of a broader narrative, the idea that the Nazis stole the swastika from the faraway and exotic East. While I will admit that 19th century Orientalists probably brought more awareness to the symbol in the West, considering that the swastika and symbols similar to it were used in the West for such a long time, I think that Europeans have just as much of a claim to the symbol as anybody else does. Look, I understand the baggage that comes with the symbol today, but I don't think that Hitler using the swastika is cultural appropriation or something. But one thing I will give Xidnaf credit for is that yes, many people did view the swastika as a symbol unique to the so-called Aryan race, and this is of course a false assertion. The swastika existed in the Indus Valley civilization prior to the Aryan invasion, and in other places like the Americas and West Africa.
Maybe Aryans interbred with other races in Europe too, but who interbred with who and in what ratios produced all of the different modern European nations, except Germany, which is the only place where there are still pure Aryans.
I don't know if we should consider early European farmers to be a different race than the steppe people, but the fact is that different European groups do have varying levels of Yamnaya-like admixture. Now, obviously, Germans aren't pure Aryan. There's nobody alive today that could safely be called pure Aryan. They just don't exist.
Maybe Jesus, even though he was born to non-Aryan Semitic language-speaking Jews, was miraculously an Aryan, because miracles. Maybe Christianity actually has nothing to do with Judaism and is actually a direct descendant of Germanic paganism and is a pure Aryan religion. Maybe we should get rid of the Old Testament because it was written by Jews, and maybe the entire Catholic Church is just a Jewish conspiracy, and so is communism, and so is capitalism, and so is everything! And you can probably see where this is going.
So now we're actually getting to beliefs that could actually be considered strange or racist these days by modern academics. I'm just not really a big fan of how linear this framing is. It starts out with Indo-European language family and it ends up with genocide. I just don't like how that's framed, to be honest.
But these were the kinds of ideas that were being thrown around in the century leading up to the Nazis. But before I talk about them, I'd just like to point out that the whole idea of an Aryan people ancestral to Europeans never made much sense to begin with. Remember how some Sanskrit speakers called themselves Aryans? Well, for one thing, it was only ever the Indo-Aryan branch of the Indo-Europeans who called themselves that. None of the others did, which makes it look a lot more like this was an innovation of one branch and not something that can be traced back to the root. For another thing, even at the time, they used it more as a sort of cultural signifier to refer to anyone who spoke the language and practiced the Vedic religion. Loads of people in the Vedas are called Aryan even though they clearly have non-Indo-European names, so they obviously didn't think of it as some kind of racial category.
So as far as we know, words related to Aryan are only associated with the Indo-Iranian branch, like Xidnaf said, but this is not entirely without controversy. There have been attempts to propose a Proto-Indo-European ancestor for the word, or cognates in other Indo-European languages, but it remains undecided whether or not cognates actually exist or not. Now, regarding the historical use of the term Aryan, I don't think that it was defined just by culture and language, but it's not to say that it was just a racial category in the modern sense of the word. The truth is that it had complex ethnic and religious connotations. Now, the Indo-Iranian words for Aryan are commonly defined as noble, but as we're going to see, this definition only really makes sense if we read noble as nobility, aristocracy, or of a prestigious lineage, rather than just being generally honorable or virtuous. In ancient Iran, we know from things like the inscriptions on the tomb of Darius the Great that the Old Persian word Arya referred to one's lineage and not one's character. It's clear that this word was an ethnic identifier for Iranians and that they used it to set themselves apart from the people that lived around them. And this could be considered, an early example of racial thinking. And I'd argue that the way the Vedic Sanskrit term Arya was used in the Vedas was actually more like a modern racial category than the Old Persian word. The issue is that Xidnaf probably hasn't actually read or studied the Vedas, and like most people, they just make broad claims about the contents of the Vedas without citing it at all. The Vedas aren't just 4 books. In reality, they're 4 categories divided into 4 layers, each layer having at least one collection of hymns, which then has multiple recensions associated with the ancient Vedic schools of thought. So when Xidnaf says that there are people in the Vedas with non-Indo-European names that are called Aryan, I don't know what they're talking about. Not to mention that this doesn't even necessarily dispute the use of the term Arya as a racial category, it just proves that other languages influence the Vedic people, which is a fact. If you were to read a modern academic translation of the Rigveda Samhita of the Shakala recension, such as the one written by Stephanie W. Jamison and Joel P. Brereton in 2014, you'd find a lot of interesting quotes regarding the term Arya. There's a passage where they set themselves apart from the Dasyus, which is thought to be the native people of the Indus Valley civilization, using the term Arya Varna, which would translate roughly to the Aryan hue or Aryan color. It also describes the Dasyus as being dark-skinned, saying the Vedic god Indra will wipe them off the face of the earth, and how they will be dominated under the Aryans. It also makes a point of them following no commandment, which in this context means they're impious. So not only do I think that the word Arya in the Rigveda did have heavy racial connotations, but I believe it's actually one of the best examples of racial thinking in pre-Columbian times. Anyways, for the next chunk of this video, Xidnaf describes how the Nazis used the term Aryan and how they applied it to their society. Now, I actually don't have much to say about this portion. I think it's, fairly accurate. To summarize it, it's basically just pointing out that the Nazis had a sort of rocky relationship with the word Aryan and preferred to invoke Germanness and Nordic identity instead most of the time because of the fact that Aryan had a more pan-European or even pan-racial connotation to it.
Meanwhile, in Iran, the word developed more specific ethnic connotations and eventually morphed into the modern word Iran. Linguists mostly stopped using the term to refer to language, with the one exception that they still use the term Indo-Aryan to refer to a family of Indo-European languages centered around India. Besides that, they felt a strong desire to distance themselves from the word, for obvious reasons.
So yeah, that's pretty much the end of the video. I don't really feel like the last part was really that bad. I feel like it was mainly towards the beginning that I had an issue with some of the things they were claiming about science, claiming that a lot of the things that modern academics say today are actually 19th century pseudoscience. I completely disagreed with all of that. And when it comes to the historical use of the word Aryan in places like ancient India and Iran, I feel like there were some issues there. But other than that, that's really all I needed to say. Thank you all for watching. Thanks for I think we're almost at 1,000 subscribers now. I think as of recording this, I'm like 990, something like that. So yeah, I greatly appreciate it. And I hope you guys are having a great day. And I look forward to seeing you guys again soon. See ya.